This narrator feels or truly experiences time in a different way, that he can kind of jump around from his past to his present to his future. It's all sort of mixed together. Chronological time doesn't make sense to him. So in the novel, it'll often pivot from the narrator apparently being younger, and then all of a sudden he claims to be somewhat older engineer. And then he's graduated from school and he has a car and so on. And it's never resolved when all of these moments are taking place, whether they're imaginings, whether it's his writing and he's, speculating on his future and so on, or whether it's something else.
Hello, listeners to the Big Book Project. I'm so happy to have with me today Professor Jose Vergara. He's a professor in the Russian department at Bryn Mawr College, and he is on a mission to get everyone to know about the Russian author Sasha Sokolov. Welcome, Jose.
Hi, Lori. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very delighted to have you, and I'm very delighted to, for the first time, become introduced to the books of this really remarkable Russian author who I think likes to say that his writing is poetry, a combination
Mm-hmm.
of prose and poems. And I think that what makes these books so interesting and complex and really rich for a lot of thinking and just the kind of books that we like to talk about on the Big Book Projects is that he does something with these books that is intentionally destabilizing in both the narrative and the style and the way things shift around. So maybe we start out from the top. Maybe tell us a little bit about this author and why you think he's so significant to Russian letters.
Sure, definitely. So, what I usually say is that Sasha Sokolov is a bit of a writer's writer, that a lot of Russian writers in particular know about him, reference him as a major influence, that he changed how they thought about writing, the possibilities of the Russian language, and I'm sure we'll get into this kind of his explorations and unravelings of what's possible with Russian. But this is something that a lot of writers report finding important in his works and kind of taking on in their own directions. At the same time, it's a bit difficult to read his works for reasons you kind of alluded to, that he's not interested in traditional plot, traditional narrative, traditional characters. There are, in some novels, characters who may be alive or dead at the same time. The timeline is a little fuzzy occasionally. So he's not widely popular. He's kind of an author, like you said, that fits right in with the Big Book Project, that writes intensely and very carefully and well-crafted works. He's also, I think, is worth mentioning often, for right and wrong reasons, I think, compared to Salinger, in that he's written or I should say published very little. His first novel, A School for Fools, was published in 1976. And there's a whole wild story that he sent it off from the Soviet Union and went through Israel, if I'm not mistaken, and eventually ended up in the United States and published by Artis, a publishing house that was based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that published a lot of Soviet writers who couldn't publish there, or emigre writers, and so on. And it made a big splash. Nabokov gave it praise, which was pretty rare for Nabokov to do. He was famously pretty critical of a lot of writers, especially Soviet writers, but he saw something in A School for Fools. And then after that, Sokolov wrote Between Dog and Wolf, which was published in 1980. Then after that, the novel Palisandria, in English is translated as Astrophobia, about decade after Between Dog and Wolf. And then since then, it's been sparse. There's been some shorter works, a kind of three-part piece called Triptych. That's again this kind of highly refined poetry. It's prose poetry of a kind. It looks like poetry. He published a few short pieces here and there, but really very little. And yeah, he's not interested in being a public figure in any way. I found, as a scholar of his works, that he's definitely open to engaging with readers and with scholars who want to learn more about his works. But he's not out there looking to be a public figure in any real way.
And he would be how old now?
He was born in 1943.
Three, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we don't have an indication whether we might ever see another novel from him.
I would wager not another
Okay.
novel. Yeah, a few years ago in 2021, around there, 22, a colleague, Martina Napolitano, and I were putting together a special issue of a Slavic journal devoted to him, a collection of articles. And we reached out to him to ask if he would answer some of our questions for an interview. And he actually sent back a new work. It was like I forget the exact number, like 40 pages or so. Another kind of proem, Proem, which was a total surprise to us that we were able to include that in the volume. It wasn't a novel, but it was really exciting to read this as well.
Yeah, that is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for no other reason other than it's chronological, maybe we will we'll start talking about his first novel, A School of Fools, and it has been reissued in a newer translation by New York Review of Books Classics. Um, Maybe give us a little bit of indication what one can expect if you go to your local bookstore and pick this book up, and then maybe we can get into some of the themes and motifs that he uses in the book.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Um, where to start, which is how the novel also begins, now that I think of it. But it's a novel about a young man living in the Soviet Union somewhere, not in a city, though he has some connections to the city. But he's either suffering from some kind of mental disability, so he has multiple personalities perhaps, or in fact it's a kind of dual narrator. And the novel is divided into 5 parts. Parts 1 and then 3, 4, and 5 deal with his life, his relationships to his parents, his school teacher, other school administrators, these authority figures, and how he relates to them, and also his interactions with nature. For Sokolov, nature is really crucial, in particular to his first 2 works. Parts of the novel are what is often described as stream of consciousness. So no punctuation, you can expect that if you pick up the novel in certain parts. When I think when the narrator's particularly excited about something, it'll switch to this mode of stream of consciousness. Other parts are not written in that way. This second part, I don't think this is giving anything away. This second chapter is actually a series of vignettes, these short stories that, if you're reading closely, carefully, you can see allusions to other parts of the novel. So it's unclear who exactly composed these notes, these stories written on the veranda. The second part of the novel, is it the same first-person narrator as the other parts, or is it a different narrator, the author, someone else? But that's another kind of idiosyncrasy of the novel that I think is worth mentioning.
Yeah. So the narrator, he's he's actually in big chunks of this novel living in an institution, what they refer to as the school for fools, right?
Hmm.
Um, and he speaks often to this double, or maybe it's a younger self or an older self. We're not quite sure. For purposes of the Russian language, and I don't have a Russian language copy of the book, but um, and just so our listeners know, there's uh, Russian has the plural you and the singular you, and the plural you is used for when you want to be formal with the singular you. Anyway, to make a long story short, when he's addressing his double, is that clear in the in the Russian whether it's plural or singular?
Yeah, it's the singular. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
that's
But there's this, like you said, it's unclear um, whether it's who this other self is, and in
yes.
particular, you mentioned whether it's the past or the future self. Um, so I think also worth mentioning is what he refers to as this problem or disease that's related to time that a grandparent of his allegedly also suffered from. So this narrator feels or truly experiences time in a different way, that he can kind of jump around from his past to his present to his future. It's all um, sort of mixed together. Chronological time doesn't make sense to him. So in the novel, it'll often pivot from the narrator apparently being younger, and then all of a sudden he claims to be a somewhat older engineer. And then he's graduated from school and he has a car and so on. And it's never resolved when all of these moments are taking place, whether they're imaginings, whether it's his writing and he's speculating on his future and so on, or whether it's something else.
Yeah. And he's in love with a
Mhm.
woman who we think is one of the teachers at the school,
Right.
Veta. And maybe I think you've selected a passage that maybe you want to read to introduce us to her.
Yeah, definitely. So, like you said, this is one of the female characters in the novel. Her name is Vieta, or Vietka. In some forums, she's a teacher at the school. In another, she's a sex worker at the railway station that's nearby his town. She's also the daughter of one of the teachers, um, or a scientist that lives nearby, Leonardo in one form. Um, so it's someone he really respects and loves, or has fallen in love with. But it's also unclear whether she's real or not. So this is an introduction to this character, and also where the perspective seems to shift to her. What's your name? I'm called Vietka. I'm a branch of acacia. I'm a branch of the railroad. I'm Vieta, impregnated by the gentle bird called Rossignol. I'm pregnant with the future summer and with the crash of the freight train. Here, take me, take me. I'm wilting away. That's quite inexpensive. At the station, I cost no more than a ruble, and I'm sold by tickets. And if you want, ride just like that for free. There will be no inspector. He's sick. Wait, I'll undo it myself. You see, I am all white as snow. Well, shower me whole with kisses. Nobody will notice the petals are invisible on white, and I'm tired of everything. Sometimes I appear to myself simply as an old hag who walks her whole life over the burning hot locomotive slag on the railroad embankment. She's totally old, hideous. I don't want to be an old hag, my darling. No, I don't want to. I know I'll die soon on the rails. I'm in pain. I'll be in pain. Let me go. When I die, let me go. These wheels are in axle grease. Your palms. What are your palms in these gloves? I told a lie. I'm Vieta, pure white branch. I bloom. You don't have the right. I dwell in orchards. Don't shout. I'm not shouting. The approaching train is shouting, Tra ta ta ta. What's the matter? Tra ta ta. What tra? Who's there? Ta. Where? There. Where? There. Vieta branch, willow, willow's branches, there outside the window, in that house, tra tra, doom. Yeah, I'll pause there.
So that really gives a great feel for the way this narrative goes.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of dreamy, it's kind of surreal. There we feel that things are shifting around us and we don't really it's disorienting or destabilizing
Yeah.
and quite intentionally so. So I know that you've taught between Dog and Wolf to your college students.
Mm-hmm.
And what about this book? Have you taught this book, A School for Fools, and what would be your, I guess, your advice for people that want to get into it or that feel that just feel uncomfortable in the instability of what they're reading and don't like the dealing with the ambiguities
Mm-hmm.
here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think um, I have taught it. Um, I think only once. I've, for some reason, shifted to Between Dog and Wolf, which I think is even more complicated in many
I
ways.
agree.
um, but yeah, I did teach it, and I taught it in a course where I think it made sense in terms of what I was going for and sort of the development of this modernist tradition in Russian literature. Um, to answer your question more directly, I think what I would say is, first of all, that passage I read is definitely one of the more disorienting ones. What's happening there is this drift into the kind of dreamy, like you said, surreal um, mode that Sokolov uses occasionally. But the whole novel isn't written like that. There are passages that, yes, the time sort of shifts, but there's punctuation. This part had no punctuation. It's more free flowing. Um, so I think just being open, receptive to those parts of the novel, but recognizing that there's more to it. There's variation is step one. Step two is maybe just approaching the novel with an open mind and appreciation for the language. And I think Alexander Boguslawski, who translated this edition, I think did a good job with it. For Sokolov, this poet, prose poet, whatever we want to call him, language is really crucial. That's the hero of the novel is language. Um, he's interested in playing with language, and it's a cliche, but just letting it sort of flow over you is, I think, a perfectly fine and productive way to read the novel. To appreciate these different images and these chains of images that appear. In some ways, it's a little clearer in the Russian. For example, in the passage that I just read, Vietka in Russian means branch, like on a tree or a plant, but it's also her name, and it's also a branch of a railway. So one image, the name, leads to the branch of the tree, which also leads to the branch of the railroad. Um, so another way to go about it is to, not in an overly academic way, but in a curious way, maybe if you're reading this novel for the first time, just try to pay attention to how one image will lead to another, how one metaphor, one symbol, one image links to something else, how we move from point A to point B. There often, or probably always, is some logic to it. And it might be more intuitive or more surreal, more rooted in the linguistic and kind of oral connections of these words, rather than like a traditional plot or traditional narrative. But there's a lot there, I think, to take out and appreciate.
Well, let's pick up on one of the recurring uh, things that come up in the book, and that
Mm-hmm.
is this idea of the railroad
Yeah.
and what the railroad might mean for the characters in this book. So you mentioned that Vieta is sometimes uh, sometimes a teacher, but sometimes she seems to morph into this prostitute that hangs out at the railroad station.
Hmm.
And her name is also the diminutive of it is also the word for branch in Russian. So when we're reading the book and we're coming across these recurring instances of the railroad, obviously, it's travel, it's escape, it's a transitory place. It's kind of the train station is kind of a liminal space where
Hmm.
uh, you're not really in life, but you're not really going anywhere either. So how
Yeah.
do you think about that, the image of the railroad, and the way it works in this book?
Uh, yeah, that's another good question. I think it functions in a number of different ways, some of which you've mentioned already. I think it's toward the end of the novel. The narrator is again talking about time, and he references how the train kind of travels in a circle, sort of eating its own path, eating its own direction, I guess. Um, so I think it's also functioning in that way as a symbol or as a representation of this um, alternative sense of time, right? That things might recur, that this narrator can sort of jump around and move around time in a circular fashion and repeat events, um, which is also tied to the recurrence of all these images and moments. It will often return to a scene where he's talking to his teacher in the school's bathroom, or different encounters he has with Leonardo or with Vietka, or these almost connections with her. Um, yeah, so I think the train um, in this novel, in Astrophobia as well, and probably in general, is just so closely related for Sokolov and his art, his aesthetics, with this concept of time. That time might be circular, might repeat. I think also it functions as um, some kind of, it's not unique to Sokolov certainly, but symbol of modernity. This technology that shifted and changed relationship with time and space for people. And again, other writers, for Dostoevsky, this was also really important, and in other traditions as well. But it's also operating in that key, or that way here too.
Yeah. I know that you wrote an article, and I couldn't get access to it.
Yeah,
And it was about the bird imagery. And was I think it was in this book, right? Versus
between dog and wolf.
between. Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
But there are some birds in here, and
yeah, yeah.
there are also butterflies.
Hmm.
And of course, the butterfly, you I instantly think of Nabokov.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, so what's the maybe you can tell us in terms of what Sokolov is doing with these images of birds and butterflies, and maybe they mean different things. It's a question.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think with the butterfly, just like with other natural imagery in the novel for the protagonist, the narrator, it's this idea of transformation. So at certain points of the novel, he um, claims to, I guess, transform into uh, a flower, and he refers to himself as Nymphea, also student so and so. He's never named exactly. Um, but this idea of transformation, I think, is really central to the novel. We can read it as a really weird coming of age novel, coming of language novel, that the narrator and Sokolov, above him, um, is trying to break out of the strictures of the Soviet Union, the strictures of Soviet writing, which was so limited and prescribed. So these images of like the butterfly or the flower, the narrator transforming into flower and turning to nature as a means of breaking away from what's being imposed on him by various authority figures. I think that's part of what's going on. Yeah, here we have also, as far as the bird goes, there's these different moments with the night sucker, right? This bird with kind of a weird mouth.
The goat
Goat sucker,
sucker, I
yeah, yeah.
think.
Excuse me,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Which has some
Yeah.
nocturnal, as far as I understand. Um, and there, I think too, it's acting as a kind of, simply put, strange animal that the narrator kind of associates with as well. Um, yeah, if anyone who might hear this isn't familiar with the goat sucker, you should look them up. They're peculiar looking birds. Yeah, and I think Sokolov is interested in the kind of oddities of nature in many cases. In Between Dog and Wolf, a key bird is the hoopoe, which is also a very striking bird. I've never actually seen one in real life, but they're fairly common in certain parts of the world. But they have this plume, this sort of crown-like plume, cool colors. Um, and I think I haven't. This wasn't necessarily part of that article, but thinking about it, I think things like the goatsucker and the hoopoe and other striking elements of nature speak to Sokolov's fascination with and the fascination with individuality and kind of striking your own path and resisting the kind of conformity of this, not just the Soviet Union, but any society or community that will restrict you in that way.
Well, maybe similar to the goat sucker, there's also a creepy witch
Mm-hmm.
in this novel, and she's got a deformity. I
Mm-hmm.
think she doesn't have one leg, or
Right.
she walks with a crutch, and that's something we'll see when we get to the next novel as well. But there there is this theme or motif of
Mm-hmm.
deformity, physical deformity. I mean, our student so and so is there's something troubling about his mind. I guess that's why he's in this institution. But these physical deformities come up periodically in these works, and so what do you think's going on with that motif?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's really central to Sokolov's art. Pretty much every work. One of his first stories was um, about a blind man. This was published before A School for Fools in a Soviet newspaper journal, and it's absolutely a recurring motif. This idea of disability in various ways. I think, first of all, I would say I think more work should be done. Reading his novels, reading his texts from a disability studies perspective, and I'm not an expert in that field, but I think more work can be done. I do think in A School for Fools, what ends up happening is this narrator who has something quote unquote wrong with his mind, his perception of time, his perception of reality, um, is situated as the hero, as someone who kind of sees things in the way that the rest of society does not, but is maybe more true, I guess, and can access the world unlike everyone else. And for Sokolov, that's important and significant. Um, the other example you raised of this woman who works at the school but also lives nearby the student and has this problem with her leg, and she walks and he hears this noise. Um, and all of these noises that he hears also become associated with sex, and in particular hearing his mother, or knowing that his mother is having sex and is having an affair, and so on. Um, um, yeah, so there's this connection for him between disability and sex, and like growing up in this fear of adult knowledge of different kinds. Um, that's happening there. It's maybe more relevant to Between Dog and Wolf, but one way to look at uh, the predominance, I guess, of disability in his works is also that it's contextual, historical. After World War II, many men in particular, but not only, came back from World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as Russians call it, missing legs or missing limbs of various kinds. So it's also, it can also be, the question can also be answered in that way, that it's simply a reflection of the time. And often Sokolov's works are seen as to some extent outside of reality, or not really interested in the social world in which he was living before he emigrated to away from the Soviet Union. He's moved around a lot, but there are these traces of reality. It's just often warped in some way, and in this case, it's this woman becomes a witch-like figure for student so and so.
Yeah, that's interesting point that you make, because but for the railroad, I really think this novel could take place in the 1700s, or it could be taking place somewhere in Russia, like almost today. Like we really just don't, I don't think, unless I missed it, have a clear sense of place or year in which all of this stuff is happening in the book.
Right. Yeah. It's not concrete in that way, and if you know the context and you know the author's biography, it's easy to see certainly like the idea of Soviet newspapers, and there's some references of like these things being written. You can piece together um, some of it, but it's not explicit. It's not his main concern. The School for Fools isn't, or wasn't, only the Soviet Union. If we read it allegorically,
Yeah.
um, it's more general, and I think more powerful and more important because of that.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can touch, before we move to Between Dog and Wolf, on um something that I think is a major concern of this novel. And
Mhm.
uh, the narrator uh, repeats this this statement: "We have a problem with time,"
Mhm.
meaning that, I guess, that that it, that the school has a problem, or we as a people have a problem, or we, in terms of you and me, my double, have a problem with
Right.
time. Uh, do you want to address that a little bit?
Yeah. I think it's certainly this uh, disease, or whatever it might be called, with his mind, the problem of him jumping around and thus causing frustration for his parents, who don't understand him. Um, I I also think, you know beyond the novel, outside of the novel, again, Sokolov is just fascinated with the idea of time, and each of his novels represents time in different ways. Many of his works. Um, so it's also a problem with time in that sense, that he's trying to comprehend time differently, like the physics of time, and it's never addressed as such. But like um, the relativity of time is important in Between Dog and Wolf, in School for Fools, to some extent as well. Um, and again, it's not the main thing, but I think the problem with time also speaks to the Soviet Union and how he felt restricted there, and that maybe time or one's connection to the modernist past, in his case in particular, was distorted, was limited. Writers that were publishing in the teens, 20s, 30s, but were banned later when Sokolov was growing up, and it was much harder to access those sorts of things. That's another problem with time, a kind of literary or cultural problem with time, that is important to him. He certainly draws from that pool of literature, both Russian, Soviet, and Western.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can, and I'm sure there will be opportunities to make some comparisons between A School for Fools and between Dog and Wolf, but uh, maybe we'll dig into Dog and Wolf. And
Mhm.
there, I only kind of understand this because of the very helpful introduction by the translator at the beginning of that book. But there is a very purposeful structure to
Right.
that book that maybe A School for Fools. I don't know if the structure follows a system. Or I didn't quite pick it up, but why don't you tell us about Dog and Wolf and the structure that we see in that book?
Sure. Yeah. Again, where to start? Between Dog and Wolf consists of 18 chapters, and it has sort of rhythm to it. There are prose chapters as well as poetry chapters. There are five um, poetry poetry chapters, which consist of a series of poems, um, an equal number per chapter, a poetry chapter, except the final one, which consists of a single poem. Each of the poems are called notes, and the idea is that these are poems that are written by one of the maybe narrators, protagonists of the novel. And then the prose chapters are, half of them are written in the first person by one of the main characters, Ilya. And it's written as a letter of complaint to the local investigator, a complaint about something that the um, hunters, the gamesmen in this region of the upper Volga River, something that they've done to him. It's, again, never entirely clear, but it's this uh, sometimes long-winded, complex, very colloquial language in this first-person letter. And then the other set of prose chapters are not in the first person mostly, and they concern mostly again a second protagonist, Yakov, who may or may not be the son of Ilya, may or may not have other connections to him, but he's a warden, a gamekeeper of this region in the upper Volga River. And he spends his time, as the novel often says, philosophizing, just thinking and thinking about art, thinking about the people he encounters, and so on. And again, these chapters aren't from his perspective, but they are focused on him, sometimes vocalized through him. Um, yeah, that's a general structure. I think it also is important to note that it's unclear to some degree who wrote what. Yakov may be the author of the notes. It's possible he's the author of the whole thing. He's adopting the voice of Ilya. But yeah, that's the kind of alternating narrators and alternating styles of the book.
And Ilya's a grinder, so he
Mhm.
sharpens things.
Right.
And Yakov is a whipper in. Tell us about what a whipper in is.
So my understanding is he takes care of the dogs, the hunting dogs. Prepares them for the hunt. Is a gameskeeper. Just make sure things are on the up and up in this these hunting grounds, I guess. It's not like a national park or wherever. I guess people don't hunt in national parks. I'm not a hunter. Where it's not a designated place where he's managing it in a super formal way, but he's in charge of these dogs and helping the hunters. Um, and I could mention, after um, attempts at going to school for journalism, for studying languages, doing different things. Sokolov actually took up a job as a gameskeeper, a whipper in the Upper Volga. He lived in this region that's it was rough. It was very rough, based on his account. A lot of drinking took place there. There was a lot of violence. The novel is based in large part on what he witnessed there, as well as the language that he heard there. So, in particular, in Ilya's chapters, a lot of the language there is incredibly colloquial, folkloric. It's not the language that he was hearing in Moscow, but rather the language of these hunters who were often drunk, who were not particularly well educated. But it was a different sort of Russian in the so-called backwoods of the Upper Volga. And Sokolov took all this in, all this linguistic material, and all the reality, I guess, of this region, and produced Between Dog and Wolf out of that.
And there is it might be too much to say a plot, but there's a context, a setup for what's going on with these two characters
Mm-hmm.
and some of the other more peripheral characters, and it's revenge, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard to spoil this novel
Yes, I agree.
if anyone wants to skip ahead a little. I guess that's doable. But yeah, so what happens is this kind of sequence of what I've called Gogolian violence. This sort of it's not quite nonsensical, but just sudden burst of violence. So Ilya is walking home. There's different accounts of like what's actually happened, but he's walking home across the frozen river. He encounters what he thinks is a wolf, and he prepares for battle. And it's compared to this mythic battle on ice in Russian, Slavic um, legend. He beats the dog. He's victorious. He's heading home. He may or may not have his crutches. They may have been taken. They might have been left behind somewhere, but it's all unclear. But it turns out that it was not a wolf. It was actually a dog. And the title of the novel comes from this phrase from the Latin, but also in the French and in Russian, between dog and wolf, meaning the time of day, dusk, or sunset, when a shepherd might have trouble distinguishing a wolf from his own dog in a pasture. It's unclear. It's this indeterminate zone of time where things are sort of blending. And that's really the central metaphor of the novel. But as a result of this, in one telling, the hunters come back and steal Ilya's crutches, and as a result of that, he goes out and kills some of the dogs, and consequently, they kill him. So the question is he still alive? If he is alive, then how is he writing this letter of complaint about his own murder? It's this strange topsy-turvy world where, again, in the in-between zone, the between dog and wolf, characters can be both alive or dead. They may or may not be related in different ways in terms of paternity, let's say. Yeah, things. It's not either or. It's both and.
Right. And this kind of I don't know, it's not I want to say dichotomy, but it's not in this book, but this either and really gets, I think, kind of formulated a bit around the image of the Volga River, or
Mm-hmm.
what in the book is referred to as, I think, the Itil. Is that like the Tatar word for it?
Right. Yeah.
And it's it serves a little bit, I think, like the river Styx in Greek
Hmm.
mythology. So you've got on one shore of the river, are the living, and then on the other shore, are the dead, and the the passageway between the two in this book is extremely fluid, and that people seem to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
like hanging out on both banks of the river on any particular time.
yeah. That's exactly right. And at one point, Ilya, I think, is the one who says that here we may dead, but if we cross over, we'll find ourselves among the living and can continue on. Um, so yeah, just like the railroad, the river is really central to Sokolov's art. There's another really key passage. I won't find it quickly, but a character who's a kind of mentor to Ilya, someone who seems wise despite how much drinking they do, describes how the river is like time, and sometimes time moves really quickly or feels like it moves really quickly, and that's like rapids in a river where the water moves really quickly. In other parts, it's very slow, like in the backwoods, um, not quite stagnant, not still water, but it's just moving much more slowly. And as a result of that, the idea, the parallel is that time might be experienced in these different ways. That um, in one area along this river, time is moving more slowly, in others, it's moving more quickly. So the perceived time of those characters doesn't quite align, and thus someone may be alive in one part and dead in another.
Well, I think just to give our listeners a taste of um, the the poetry here, but in this case, I think we're going to be reading actually part of the poetry
Mm-hmm.
straight up from Between Dog and Wolf. Do you want to read that passage that you picked out? Because I think it will contrast really well the two different styles of the book.
Yeah, definitely. So this is note 33, one of the poems in the technically the penultimate section of poems. Um, okay, it's called Return. The hunter pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. A crow emitted an untimely caw. Somewhere, a gramophone screamed inspired, and turnips smelled just like a life ago. Why do we rush, waste effort as deranged, and hasten through the plowed field and the glen? When we come home, nothing's really changed, and in the mirror, the same good citoyen.
It's nice. Do you, having studied both of these novels quite a bit and taught both novels, do you see the evolution of Sokolov's work from A School for Fools to Between Dog and Wolf, or is it better just to look at them as just two different works of art that share some similar themes, like time and
Yeah,
memory and
it's an excellent question. I mean, I think to me, Between Dog and Wolf, well, yeah, well, I'll finish that thought. To me, Between Dog and Wolf was really like I'm blanking on the term. It just moved things light years in terms of what was happening in Russian literature, particularly at this time, the late Soviet period. There were other fascinating, intriguing writers, but what Sokolov was able to accomplish, the structure is great and innovative in its own way as well. This mix and the pattern he did, but also the language, incorporating these different registers um, from the colloquial hunter's language, but blending that in the novel as a whole with um, parodies of 19th century Russian literature. So in a number of these poems, they read as if they're 19th century poems. There's a lot of Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev, who wrote Fathers and Children, other authors. So he's building on that. There's a chapter that um, Yakov is reading a book, and all of a sudden we're transported to the 19th century, and it reads very much like Gogol again. And Sokolov even uses the old orthography. So before the Civil War, before the revolution in Russia, around that time, there were some letters that were removed. And so he uses this old orthography. So the language itself, the text is reflecting this shift in time. So I guess all of which to say, I think what he accomplishes in Between Dog and Wolf certainly build on A School for Fools and the innovations there, the kind of free flow stream of consciousness, some of which we have again here, but he just does much more. I love A School for Fools, but I think for me personally, Between Dog and Wolf just enriched many of these themes, this fascination with time, brought in so many different components, so many layers and histories of the Russian language, and pulled it apart, showed what was possible, and in creating this another version, I guess, of his poetry, that to me makes it a development of what came before, but it's also quite different. I don't know if that totally answered your question, but I was sort of all over there. But it's again, I guess, a both and, yeah, a development, but also it's something quite different from A School for Fools.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by some of the ekphrastic elements
Yeah,
in
yeah.
between Dog and Wolf, and um, the the way that they pop up not just in the prose sections but also in the poetry sections.
Mm-hmm.
Ekphrasis is usually something that we think about in terms of poetry, but yeah, there's a hunting painting by Bruegel the Elder that
Mm-hmm.
is, I forget the name of the painting, but it's featured in both the prose and the poetry sections in the book.
That's right. Yeah, Winter Hunters in the Snow.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I think it was particularly, I don't know, maybe it's not that extraordinary, but I was quite taken by the way that he brings like the narrator into, like, walks him into the painting.
Mm-hmm.
So like what you're seeing in the painting like is he's experiencing what we would experience if we're seeing the painting, but he's like actually there, like he sees the dog in the foreground, and
Right.
just
Yeah.
it was a pretty special piece of writing, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's another one of these fascinating things that he's able to pull off. The sort of it's another in between indeterminate thing, right? Where he's blending reality or blending one art into another and just free flowing into that. Yakov is looking out of his window, and he's all of a sudden, maybe all of a sudden isn't quite right. It blends and transitions into the scene from the painting. And that one reality becomes now this one, and he transforms the still image into the moving image, at least of the
Yes.
narrative. Yeah, shifting the styles and genres and the forms of art here.
I've got some questions I'd like to ask you about uh, Sokolov's influences, and then the way you think he might have influenced uh, other authors that are writing now or written after. But uh, what else would you like us to know, or uh, would you like to touch on before we leave the specifics of Between Dog and Wolf?
Um, I mean, I alluded to earlier that he emigrated um, from the Soviet Union, and that's a whole story as well. Excuse me. There was a hunger strike involved. There was appeals to heads of state in Austria and in the Soviet Union. He had to get out of the country that way. And since then, he's lived all sorts of places. Canada. He was originally born in Canada. His parents were Soviet spies, and again, there's this whole adventure story there. Yeah, so he's lived in Canada, in Vermont, in Florida, Greece, various different locations, and always quite active. He's taught as a ski instructor. He's taught at various universities and Russian summer schools, those sorts of things. He remains quite active, if not public. But I think that's also important. This idea of being away from your home, and for him, his home language, Russian, was really a key motivator and key concern, I guess, with Between Dog and Wolf. This idea of being separated, and he dedicated the novel in English. The dedication is "To My Pals in Dispersion." So one way to read that, right, is his pals in exile, people who have been separated from Russia at the time of composition. Yeah, I just think that's central and really motivates or informs a lot of the narratives. This sense of loss and longing and hoping for a connection to the language and to one's past in some way. That's been taken away because of the system of the Soviet Union, at least in this case. But because of, I guess because of that, and in spite of that, he was still able to rework the Russian language and kind of make it his own. And just putting it simply, I think there's a lot of beauty in that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you find, not to take anything away from the translator of both of these works, it's the same translator. His name is
Boguslawski, yeah.
Yes, Boguslawski, a Polish citizen, I believe, right? The translations are magnificent. The way, especially with an author that like Sokolov that gets so creative and uses so many puns and word manipulations, to be able to bring forth for English readers just like the beauty and the virtuosity of the language is, I think, a real talent. But you, as a Russian reader, do you experience the books a different way when you're reading them in Russian than when you read them in English?
Yes, and I think that's always the case, with translations and with literature that's of high quality, and so well and intentionally structured and constructed and thought through. I do think Boguslawski was valiant in his efforts. He translated between Dog and Wolf into Polish first, and he came back for more. He collaborated with the author. They were friends, and he was able to work through some issues that way too, linguistic issues. It certainly is different. I still find both volumes readable in the way that they should be. They're still challenging. My students, when we read Between Dog and Wolf, are initially a little baffled, I think. But by if we spend 2 weeks, 4 sessions or 5 sessions on it, around midway, it starts clicking. And I do think the translation is part of that it still is able to carry through the linguistic play, the playfulness and also intensity of the novel still comes through. And by the end, it's often many of their favorite novels in the courses in which I teach it. And I think that's a good sign, I think, of a translation. If people who are, well, I guess being asked to read it for a class, and also are coming to it probably cold and don't have a great deal of context, are still able to appreciate it on a deep level.
Yeah.
I always, it's one of my favorite novels, so I always appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Sokolov's place in Russian letters. So we talked about Nabokov's
Mm-hmm.
impact on Sokolov and these books. But in preparing to talk to you about them, I saw some articles that talk about all kinds of artists other than writers that actually were inspirations or had an impact on maybe the way Sokolov saw innovation and art.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've seen reference to Mussorgsky, and of course, Portraits from an Exhibition is featured in Between Dog and Wolf.
Right.
Um, but are there are there figures that you know of that he's referenced in the past, or that you can see uh, their imprint on his work?
Yeah. The first place I would gesture to is the essay in the House of the Hanged, in translation anyway. This collection of essays. There's an essay which I think was originally a lecture he gave somewhere. The keyword of belles lettres. Pardon my French. And in here, he distinguishes on the one hand, artists who are interested in the what, like basic plot, traditional narrative, etc. And on the other hand, artists who are interested in the how. Those artists who are much more focused on structure and technique, in crafting things in more complex ways. And he says that the obvious champions of the latter in art are Kandinsky, Flaubert, Rimbaud, Joyce, Shostakovich, and other idealists. The supporters of what are social realists and capitalist primitivists. These are people working with the topics of the day, choosing the fashionable subjects. He lists a few people. He didn't like Vonnegut, apparently. I'm cool with Vonnegut. So he names some names of people he criticizes, but from the short list, Joyce, Shostakovich, Flaubert, elsewhere further down, he mentions Ivan Bunin, he was a novelist, short story writer as well, Russian, from the first half of the 20th century. Craft, I think craft, is the way to put it. Artists who are
Yeah.
interested in the craft, the artistic craft of writing, who really care about each letter, each word, their style. Joyce, I think, was a huge part of this, and he mentions them here. Elsewhere, he's sort of denied the initial influence of Joyce, at least. But yeah, all those kinds of writers, musicians or composers, right? Like Mussorgsky or Shostakovich, who are innovators as well. Painting, is crucial here, and this comes through in, I think, all the novels, and certainly Between Dog and Wolf, like you said. Some of the chapters are structured as pictures at an exhibition with this ekphrasis, but also music is so central. I think it's his work is a sort of synthesis of different modes of art, different kinds of art, not just literature, but also music and pictorial art as well.
I know that you wrote a book or a treatise on Joyce's influence on Russian writers.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe to broaden that a bit, to talk about Joyce and possibly Sokolov's influence on Russian writers. What are some that you uh, could identify for us that we could get an English translation if we wanted to check them out?
Mm-hmm. So, you cut out for a second. There are
Oh, sorry.
writers whom Sokolov influenced potentially.
Yeah, who Joyce and or Sokolov influenced. Yes.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. Well, a kind of third point there, an important one, is Mikhail Shishkin, who is a contemporary writer. His novels have been translated into English, several of them anyway. Maidenhair is one of them. The Light in the Dark is another. A third is in the works. Should be out by Deep Vellum in a couple of years. Um, he's a fascinating writer, I think. Certainly a sort of disciple, I guess, of Sokolov. Sokolov has also mentioned him or praised him in the kind of tradition of Nabokov doing that as well. His novels, um, like Sokolov's, sort of have multiple parts, multiple components. Maidenhair, for instance, includes the kind of diaries of a young girl who eventually becomes a singer. It's also a story of a kind of autobiographical interpreter living in Switzerland and his encounters with refugees fleeing conflict zones and trying to find refuge in Switzerland, and a couple other layers. So that I think speaks to the narrative complexity of Sokolov, but also what's important to Shishkin is language and the way he adopts different kinds of voices and registers and so on to construct these worlds. That other novel, The Light in the Dark, Pismovnik in the original Russian, is a epistolary novel between two characters. And it's not immediately clear, but it does become clear that they're writing to each other from two very different time periods. Like there's no actual way that they could be communicating. Um, so we also have that sort of temporal interest and influence. And then another one that I would recommend to Russian readers, if that's okay, and maybe to try to get someone to translate it, is this novel called Dni Savelia, the Days of Savely. It's by Grigory Sluzhitel, who's an actor, and this is, I think, still his only novel, stage actor. A young writer born in the 80s. And it's the story of a cat and kind of the life of the days of Savely, this cat. It's not stream of consciousness in this way that School for Fools is, but Sluzhitel has mentioned Sokolov as a big influence, and I believe in particular School for Fools. And I think the kind of lyricism and beauty of Sokolov's language comes through. That was kind of a thing that he picked up on from Sokolov. Yeah, so unfortunately, if you don't read Russian, that's not one you can go out and pick up right now, but either learn Russian and read Sokolov and Sluzhitel, or hopefully we'll have a translation someday.
Yeah. Well, I read Russian very slowly and poorly. So to say just go out and learn Russian so you can
No, I
so you
know,
can
yeah.
read a very complex novel like A School for Fools, that'll take you a few years,
Take some time, yeah, yeah.
but a laudable goal because Russian is a beautiful language, and it would be great if more people could speak it and read it.
Hmm.
Well, Jose, thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us today and introducing us to Sasha Sokolov. And uh, yeah, if you want to dig into a big book, big in terms of of dense, beautiful prose that you need to struggle with a bit and get your head around, but also let yourself kind of breathe about the fact that it's ambiguous and there aren't clear answers. these books are the way to go. So thank you. I really appreciate you being here and talking to us.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure. And I do hope people will read, more people will read Sokolov. So, yeah.
I do too. I do too. Thank you.
Thank you.